I have thought long and hard about how to go about this podcast, what I should include, what I should talk about, and what angle I should come from. And I decided, I got a lot of really good questions from you guys on Instagram, where obviously I've been sharing a lot about the reality of the situation for us in Israel and trying to debunk many of the myths. And I got lots of great questions from all over the place. But I decided that the best way to come at this is to first of all define the who I'm talking to. And in this podcast episode, hopefully I'll be able to do more. I want to talk predominantly to those of you who are not Jewish, not Muslim, in the Western world. You saw what happened on October the 7th, the massacre, the killing of babies, of children, burning them alive, torturing them before they died, the rape of women, the absolute massacre of 1,300 and counting Israelis, and the kidnapping of 200 Israelis and counting. And you were absolutely gobsmacked, absolutely horrified. But now you're watching as this drags on, you're watching the narrative shift, as it always does, towards a more pro-Palestinian stance. And you know that there was something desperately wrong with what happened, but you're also hearing lots and lots and lots of reports of this being disproportionate, this being, very, very anti-Israel rhetoric, that Israel should have restraint, and they've done the same to Palestinians for 75 years, that Israel is an apartheid, that they've taken land. But you sense that you don't have the full story, and there are details that are missing from the story that you're being told. And I want to attempt in this podcast to talk to you and fill in some of the gaps. I've said on Instagram, and I'll say here, I am obviously biased. I don't think there are unbiased voices in this, but I am going to attempt to fill in some of those gaps. And while recognizing there is another side to this. Another podcast episode that I desperately want to make is for Jews and Israelis, and talk to you guys about how to talk about this conflict in a way that doesn't alienate non-Jews around the world, because a lot of you are really doing that and not hitting the right arguments. But I'm going to leave that to one side. You'll also find this episode helpful for constructing meaningful arguments from the other side. But for now, I'm focusing on those of you who don't really have a dog in the fight and feel like there's a lot that you don't understand. I want to attempt to debunk some of the myths, like Israel's taken land, like Israel occupies Palestine, that it's an apartheid state, that Israel's been doing this, that this is for years, that this is genocide. All of these are popular sound bites that are being regurgitated, but they aren't true. They just aren't true. And it's very frustrating because, as I've said on Instagram time and time again, they take half a second to say and half an hour to explain why they aren't. They are often complete lies, and they are often complete omissions of truth, and they are sometimes half-truths. But I also want to frame this from a Western perspective of privilege, this kind of privilege of peace, that like when you're sitting in your homes in Scotland, in like Devon, in like some city in Ireland, in the US, and you do not have an existential threat on your doorstep, how easy it is to make cases of moral equivalency and to ask for restraint and to just say, can't everyone just get along? Can't we just stop killing people? This is not a luxury that Israelis have, and it's not a luxury that those of us who live here have, and it's not a luxury that many people have had throughout the history of the world. As I'm saying this, there is some kind of chainsaw or leaf blower or God knows what going off in the background. If I don't shoot this now, this episode now, it's not going to happen. So please forgive me for the background noise. It is what it is. So the first myth that I want to kind of address is, or the first soundbite that I want to address, is that Israel has stolen land from the Palestinians. I hear some kind of variation of this over and over again, that Israel has displaced whatever crazy number of Palestinians, of Arabs, and there is this kind of very oversimplified narrative that I'm sure you're aware of, and it's probably the predominant narrative that you're seeing and that you probably have in your head. And it's made out as though Israel came along, this like big, strong state, just came along, and there was this state called Palestine of Arabs who are flourishing and living in peace, and Israel just came along and colonized them, kicked them out, and told them to go somewhere else. We're taking this land now. But the history of this conflict is so much more complex than that, and so much more nuanced than that. And this is such an oversimplified narrative. I am really loath to sort of go through a history of the land and lay out all the different ways that this isn't true, and the landmarks and the years and the wars that were fought and all the different things that happened, because it always feels like when we're talking about this topic, this kind of historical and moral leapfrog of what came first, who did what first. And it's really such a futile conversation, because even as somebody who is living in modern day Israel and obviously very pro-Israel, I can see how it's not 100% black and white that Israel did nothing wrong and the Palestinians have always done something wrong to us. There is a lot of tit for tat and a lot of fighting and back and forth and a lot of things done wrong on both sides throughout the history of this conflict. I don't know if you've ever, had an argument with somebody and you're so kind of like riled up and like just stewing in your own self-righteousness of like, I haven't done anything wrong and this person is 100% wrong. And then if you actually approach it like an adult, most of the time, and there are horrible people, but most of the time you realize that you did something and they did something and things were misconstrued and things like you both contributed to the conflict. It usually takes two to tango. This is not a black and white issue of like there is a perpetrator and a victim. There is the oppressor and the oppressed. Jews and Arabs have taken turns throughout the history of this conflict to be the victim, to be the perpetrator, to be the oppressor, to be the oppressed. And there is no clear victim or perpetrator here when you look back at the whole history of the conflict. For a lot of us in the West, history is very much in black and white. But for those of us in the Middle East, history is happening now, and it's still in technicolor. It's still in every shade of grey and every color you could possibly imagine. There is so much more to this than people are making out. But I do want to take you through a few landmarks. So something that I keep hearing over and over again is that in 1947, in 1948, there was the Israeli War of Independence, right, where Israel just land grabbed and took the Palestinians' land and just kicked them out of their territory. That's the narrative that is often fed through the media. I just watched something on Channel 4 yesterday that said exactly this. But this is, again, a gross oversimplification and omitting so many details. You've got to understand that that in 1947, the UN the same UN that people go on and on and on about and listen to their opinion nowadays, the UN decided that the most humane thing, the fairest thing to do, right, was to divide the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state, because there was a situation where, prior to 1948, the independence in 1948, this was a British mandate of Palestine, right? It wasn't a sovereign country called Palestine that was run by Arabs. It was a British mandate. And there were both Jews and Arabs in the land, both Jews and Arabs who lived there prior to the British mandate, and Jews and Arabs that had moved into the area over the course of the British mandate with claims to the land. So there are Palestinian or Arabs. I don't actually agree with the term Palestinian, and maybe I'll get into that a little bit later, but there were Arabs that said, this is our land, this is where our ancestors come from, and Jews who came back and said, this is our land and our ancestors come from this. And if you do want to sort of go back to who originally owns the land, this goes back to biblical times where Jews had the land. This was a Jewish like state thousands of years ago that the Jews got kicked out of, and they were enslaved by the Egyptians. We've all read the Bible stories, right? So it ends up being, and I really hate that, again, that historical leapfrog of who came first. But the situation in 1947, 1948 was that the UN and other Western nations saw this as like, both sides have a claim to the land, so let's just split it up between the two groups of people. And you also have to remember that the reason why there were Jews there, there are Jews that go back generations and generations that were in the land that somehow didn't manage to get kicked out at some point during history, and all the different empires that were ruling that land throughout history, which I won't drag you through. But many of those Jews that were in that area leading up to 1948 were Jews who were running away from worldwide hatred of Jews and pogroms and attacks on Jews. And let's not forget the Holocaust as well. And there isn't a single family in Israel who isn't somehow affected by this. I do have some friends who, they are several generations from Israel, and Israelis are very obsessed with edot, like where you originally are from, like where your grandparents are from. Like, are you an Iraqi Jew? Are you an Ashkenazi Jew? Are you, is your family from Yemen? Is your family from Morocco? Like, the Jews and Israelis are absolutely obsessed with that topic, and that's a very, very common question when you're getting to know people. So they'll ask you from which origins you are. So my husband, for example, has half of his family are Moroccan and Algerian, and they fled the pogroms. The reason why they came to Israel is because they were well-to-do Jews in Morocco and Algeria, and Jews were being attacked across the whole country, and they had to leave, and they went to Israel. His grandmother and grandfather came here on boats with absolutely nothing. And I've heard those stories being told time and time again. And on the other side, his grandparents fled the Holocaust and fled Germany and Czechoslovakia, what was Czechoslovakia. And every single person has that kind of story in this country. So it wasn't, so Jews were being kicked out, and not just kicked out, but they were being slaughtered, they were being murdered across the world, all across the Arab world where Jews were in various countries, but also in Europe and Russia. And more and more there was this collective movement towards going to Israel. where many Jews then banded together and bought land off of Arab landowners, or they made settlements in places that didn't have anyone inhabiting it, and the population grew and grew and grew. And this was what was happening leading up to 1947. When the UN, the British found themselves in a situation where they had this mandate of Israel, and they were stuck in the middle of fighting, right? The Arabs were fighting the Jews were fighting the British, the Arabs were fighting the British, everyone was fighting everyone. And the British, being British, were like, oh, actually, this is too much hard work, let's get out of here. This isn't worth it. And the decision was to split the country up into a Jewish nation and an Arab nation. And it has to be said that Arabs had far more land than they currently have now. The Jews begrudgingly accepted this solution, this proposed solution, but the Arabs did not. And it has to be said that during this kind of carving up of the country, saying this is for Jews, this is for Arabs, a lot of people got displaced. A lot of Arabs got displaced and said, this is now Jewish land, you have to leave. But a lot of Jews got displaced as well and were told, this is now Arab land, you have to leave and go to the Jewish part, right? So it's not like just one-sided. This happened on both sides. But anyway, the Jews accepted the arrangement, the Arabs did not, and neither did any of the surrounding Muslim countries. Nobody accepted it. So in 1948, British rule ended in the territory, and the very next day, the Arab states of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Transjordan, and Egypt all attacked the one-day-old state of Israel. The Jews were perfectly happy to have this two-state solution, but all of the Arabs and all of the surrounding countries were not, and they did not want a two-state solution. They wanted all of it. All of it belongs to the Arabs. All the Jews have to get out. Now, at this stage, if you're thinking, yeah, they were in the right, the Jews didn't have any claim to the land, they didn't have any right to be there, well, then I don't think I'm ever going to convince you. But I think most of us can see how both had claims to the land, and the most sensible option was just to split it up. But anyway, that's not what happened. All of those countries then attacked the one-day-old state of Israel. Israel was supposed to just be like, that was the end of it. What should have happened is all of those very strong established countries should have just murdered all the Jews, destroyed everyone, and that's the end of it. Now it's going to be part of the Arab world. But that didn't happen. The Jews fought back, and they somehow won the war against all of these surrounding nations. And this is what Israelis call the War of Independence. It's what the Arabs call the Nakba, like the catastrophe. And it's funny that it's framed that way, right? Like, as in for the Jews, for Israelis, it's like our war of independence. It's how we got an independent state. It's how we established ourselves as having an independent state. Whereas for them, it was the catastrophe because they got some land. And they never wanted the Jews to have any land. It's our way or the highway. We get all of it, or we're going to force war on you for the rest of time. So often Israel gets pitted as Goliath in this against David, which is the Palestinians, but throughout so much of this history, it was David fighting against Goliath, and it somehow managed to win in wars like this. But I saw the Channel 4 report yesterday that just kind of brushed over, the War of Independence, where Israel then just kicked out all the Arabs and just took land off the Arabs. And they did claim land. They did seize land off the Arabs in that war and in subsequent wars. But that's what happens in war. And it is important to recognize that the Arabs started that war as well as other subsequent wars. So a similar thing happened in 1967. There was the 6-Day War. The dictator of Egypt at the time had this grand plan to attack Israel, again with the help of surrounding nations. But Israel preemptively attacked Egypt and Syria, but not Jordan. They begged the king of Jordan to not join the war, but he did anyway. And this is how Israel took control of the West Bank, because the West Bank was, it might sound strange that the West Bank is called the West Bank because it's on the eastern side of Israel. The reason why it's called the West Bank is because it was the West Bank of Jordan. But Israel in 1967, when a war was thrown upon them, then seized the land of the West Bank. After the war was fought and after the Israelis seized the land, then we're in negotiations and in talks. The Arabs wanted the land back, so they started a war. They lost the war, they lost territory, and then they wanted back the territory that they lost. And they have used that ever since to say, it's not fair. They took land off of us. They kicked us out of our land when they were the ones who started wars. And again, this gets brushed over so easily when Channel 4 or the BBC are quickly going over the history of the conflict in 30 seconds. Arab states have famously since then had their 3 no's of no recognition, no peace, no negotiations with the Israeli state. Israel has tried hard to maintain and to propose a 2-state solution for a very, very, very long time. And it has been rejected time and time again by the Arabs. Why? Because they don't want a 2-state solution. They want a 1-state solution, a Palestinian state, which never actually existed. And they want all of the Jews out. When we're talking about proportionality and what's reasonable, this is not a reasonable demand. This is not a reasonable stance to take in negotiations. Israel doesn't have that as an option. They can't acquiesce to, okay, so we'll all just die and you can have all this land back. It's not a negotiation. And again, it's similar to having a family member who just wants, who's a complete narcissist and is just like my way or the highway. There are further examples of this. In 1973, there was the Yom Kippur War, the holiest day for Jews, a day when they use no electricity, they use no, they fast for a full day. The whole country stops. Again, there was a surprise attack from a coalition of Arab powers, including Egypt and Syria. And the most recent attacks on Israel of October the 7th have been compared to this Yom Kippur War, 50 years, almost to the day after it happened. But there have been amazing leaps of progress in the region, despite this very bloody history. So I don't know how much of what I've just told you've been able to take on board, but you might have noticed Egypt coming up a lot as one of the countries that hated Israel, that wanted death to all the Jews, that just wanted them out. Well, in 1978, Israel gave Egypt the entire Sinai Peninsula, which is bigger than bigger landmass than the remaining state of Israel. They gave it all to them in exchange for a promise of peace. And Israel and Egypt have had peaceful relations and have cooperated since 1978. So, and this is also true of many other Arab nations. Israel has been criticized over the past few years, and understandably so, for going over the Palestinians' heads and saying, okay, well, we can't make peace with the Palestinians, so we're going to make peace with every other Arab nation. And they have been at peace with Jordan for some time, and they've recently established peace and agreements with Morocco, and a lot of the kind of newer Arab states like Dubai and UAE and Qatar. And they've been in negotiations with Saudi Arabia to have a peace agreement, which is absolutely massive for the Middle East, right? But the Middle Eastern Arab countries are very much divided between those who want to be democratic, who want to focus on cooperation with other nations, and who want to focus on economic prosperity of their country and in the entire region, much like we've done in Europe since the Second World War. It was inconceivable. England, Britain, and Germany were fighting in a war last century, and now there is no possible contemplation of war between those two nations nowadays. There's lots of disagreements, and the European Union and everything else is very, very, very imperfect. But the Middle East has been moving towards, I wouldn't call it like an equivalent of the European Union, but it has been moving towards more peace and cooperation, whereas there are still states in the Middle East who are not open to that kind of peace and cooperation, and not open to especially peace with the West, but in particular peace with the Jewish state. These countries are largely part of ISIS, an Islamic State, Iran being kind of the main ringleader in all of this. And Syria and Lebanon are not at peace with Israel and have massive influences by ISIS. And now Hamas has been infiltrated by ISIS and Iran, and are also just completely outright, all we want is the death of the Jews and for them to get out and all of it to be Palestine. But I think in these times, the only beacon of light is thinking about how Egypt and countries like Egypt and Israel were at war for decades, but now they have a peace arrangement, and now they have cooperative channels. And that was inconceivable a few short years ago. But now it is absolutely the reality, and Israel is also working towards peace with other nations like Saudi Arabia, which was also completely inconceivable. It's not happened yet, and there's much talk about how the recent conflict is because of those peace agreements going on, and Hamas and ISIS and Iran wanting to thwart all attempts at a peace deal with Saudi Arabia. But the fact that this was even on the table is something that has created an enormous amount of hope for Israelis and for the region in general. Now, that's just my first myth, so I want to kind of try and get through the next ones just a bit more swiftly. The next one is that Israel occupies Palestine and has been the occupier of the Gazan people, etc., for 75 years. Again, this is so easy to say. It's so easy to say Israel is the occupier, Palestinians are the occupied, but it's so untrue that it's hard to break it down. Israel left Gaza in 2005. Yes, there was a military occupation in Gaza up until 2005. But again, it ends up being this leapfrog, this kind of moral leapfrog of, well, why did Israel have to have a military occupation of that area? It's not because they wanted to just subjugate the Arabs and they saw them as less than. It's because those Arabs were trying to kill them. And again, they will say, well, you were trying to do this, and then Israel says, well, you were trying to do that. Again, it's just this like historical and moral leapfrog that is so hard to establish. Well, who cast the first stone? Who was the first one at blame? And the West is absolutely obsessed with this idea of like one person must be ultimately to blame and the other side must be completely faultless. So Israel left Gaza in 2005. 2004, 2005. I might get my dates a little bit wrong here. And since then, Hamas were elected by the Palestinian people, and then they have not run further elections. That's it. For almost 20 years, they have been in control of all of Gaza. And when Israel left in 2004, 2005, can't remember which year, there were Jews living in Gaza. It's hard to imagine that in my lifetime there were Jews living in Gaza. Guess what happened to them? They were forced by Israel to leave. They were displaced from that land. Just like Jews have been displaced in many different points in history throughout this conflict. So it is absolutely true that Palestinians have been displaced, have been forced to leave their homes, but so have Jews and so have Israelis, and that is just one example of it. This was a unilateral agreement. That means that Israel left Gaza with no promise of peace, with nothing in return from the other side. They left. It was a goodwill gesture. You get the land, we get nothing, in the hopes that you will try to build, you can build a Palestinian state. We will have a two-state solution, and we will try to have some peace agreements together. But that is obviously not what happened. From Israel leaving, what has happened is it has turned into a ISIS dictatorship of the people, where they have received insane amounts of humanitarian aid, where Israel provides its water and its water filtration system, much of its energy, much of its electricity, much of its fuel. And it receives so much aid, has received so much aid over the past 18 years from the rest of the world. All of that aid has been for one thing: to build a Palestinian state and to build prosperity in that region, to build schools, hospitals, infrastructure. But it hasn't been used for that. It has all been stolen by Hamas and put into building terror tunnels, building rockets, building infrastructure and equipment to kill Jews. And it is literally in Hamas's charter that the goal of what they're trying to do is to kill all the Jews and take back all of what they call Palestine, which is modern day Israel, which has never been, again, a Palestinian state. Israel does occupy parts of the West Bank. But again, you can get into this like moral leapfrog. The reason why they occupied it in the first place, if you remember what I was saying earlier in the podcast, was because Jordan waged war on Israel, and then the Israelis then land grabbed the West Bank and took control of the West Bank, which again is, you might say, oh well, that was wrong, they should just give it back to them. But that is what happens when you wage a war. You obviously go into it thinking that you're going to win, but sometimes you lose land, you lose lives, and that is the nature of war. That is why it is a bad idea to wage war on other countries, and that is why in the West we have moved away from this kind of strategy of just waging war on all our neighbors all the time and trying to grab as much as you want, because you run a risk of losing, and everyone loses in war. And yes, Israel has been occupying parts of the West Bank, arguably all of the West Bank since then. But look what happened when we gave them back Gaza. Okay, it turned into this Hamas, ISIS statelet that wants to kill Israel. So Israel, there has been an enormous amount of pressure on Israel to not give them back the West Bank, because we are scared. Israelis are scared. The Israel government is scared. The allies of Israel, like the US and Britain, are scared that that will also become a Hamas statelet, and we cannot let that happen. Now, the West Bank is divided up into different zones like A, B, and C, based on kind of like how much military control is there. But there are areas where, my husband and I were driving through the West Bank a few months back, and there's this great big sign in English, Arabic, and Hebrew saying, Israelis are not allowed in this area. Do not enter this area. There is huge risk of death, because what happens to Israelis when they go into those areas is they get attacked and killed by the Arabs living there, because they are so hostile towards Israel. Whereas there are other parts of the West Bank where you can freely go in and out of, not so easy for Israelis to do, but as tourists you certainly can do it. Israelis run a massive risk doing that, and there are areas where many Palestinians come into Israel to work, and they have to go through checkpoints. They have to have visas, they have to have work permits to come and work. They have to be verified to make sure that they're not terrorists. So Israel has a border, just like everywhere else has borders and control who comes in and out. We have someone an Arab who lives in the West Bank, who comes and works on our land. He has become a close friend of the family. He adores my kids, and we trust him, and we enjoy his company as well. He helps me with my Arabic. There are very, very peaceful and good relations between many people coming in and out of the West Bank. And he has said to me, obviously he's not representative of the entire, West Bank or population, but he, as well as others, have told me, it's chaos over there, and it's great. I love coming here, and I love Israel, and being part of Israel, and he earns his wage here. And people blame Israel again for people in the West Bank don't have the lives that we have. It's true, they don't live well, but it's largely to do with the mismanagement by the Palestinian Authority in that area, and again, the squandering of funds towards terrorism rather than towards building their own state. Another word that gets thrown around is apartheid. And these words are selected specifically apartheid, occupied, genocide, because they're very, very, very emotive. But again, they do come down to half truths or complete lies in many cases. So in terms of the word apartheid was a strict regime of segregation between blacks and whites. This is not the reality in Israel. Within Israel, there are 2 million Arabs living in Israel, right? Full citizens, right, of Israel. They have the same identity cards, they have the same passports as Israelis, as Jewish Israelis, as I do. They have the right to vote, they have free movement, they can go anywhere they want within Israel. They have, not only do they have the same rights to education and to work that Jewish Israelis have, but they also get much of the positive discrimination that you see in Western countries for poorer populations or minorities, where they get grants to study, and there has to be a certain quota of Arabs in certain jobs, so they actually get an advantage. And it's important to say as well, they have members of parliament, they have their own, there are Arab leaders, Arabs in the Supreme Court, there are Arab parties in the Israeli political system. This is not an apartheid state. Yes, it is true that Jews and Arabs do live very separate lives, right? They live in communities, they live very separate from each other, and have very, very distinct cultures, and they tend to cross paths in the medical system in particular, and in other jobs and industries. But this is no different to how Jews live in Britain. You have these big populations clustering in Manchester, in London, in Leeds, in all of the major cities. but they don't mix. Where I'm from in Berkshire and where my dad lives now in Devon, there isn't a single Jew to be found anywhere. And yes, there are Arabs within Israel, Arab citizens of Israel who experience racism or who are from a lower socioeconomic background or who don't have good lives. But this is true in every country. There are Arabs in the UK who live in absolute squalor. I know because I used to work as a translator in those areas, not for the Arabs, but for the French-speaking refugees there. They live in absolute, dire conditions. But there are also some very, very well-to-do and prominent Arabs in this country as well, who come from wealthy families, who are doctors and lawyers and politicians. So yes, there is racism towards Arabs. There's racism towards Jews. There's racism towards non-Jews. I can verify that, as a non-Jew that came here, just like in every other place. It's a different kind of climate here in the Middle East to what you have in Europe. It's decades behind. And so sometimes racism is more apparent. But to call it an apartheid state is a complete, just a gross misrepresentation of what's going on. And also, there are many, many Arab, we in the Western world, we tend to think of, not Arabs, Jews, as being white, Ashkenazi, kind of European descent. But just like I was talking about earlier, where Israelis are absolutely obsessed with your origins, there are Israelis who are dark-skinned, of Persian origin, of origins all over the Middle East, Iraqi, Yemeni, they come from Egyptian, they come from all different backgrounds, and some are fair-skinned and ginger and white and blonde, and there are others that are dark-skinned and from a totally different gene pool. And there are also an increasing number of Ethiopian Jews in this country. So, and there isn't a separation based on race. That is just not true. There are separations of Israel from Gaza and the West Bank. Hopefully I've explained the reasons why there are those separations, but it is not based on race. It is based on much of the time intentionality on those groups wanting to kill Jews and Israel having to put up walls and blockades and stopping them from coming through and doing what they did on October the 7th. Another soundbite that you're probably hearing a lot of is that Israel has been doing this for 75 years to the Palestinians. And I think this is one of the most disgusting lies in all of the pro-Palestine propaganda machine. On October 7th, they came into this country and opened fired on a music festival, killing 260 men, women, completely innocent people who were just there at a music festival. Most of them so far left that they're falling off a cliff on the left. Peace-loving Israelis, hippies, who are among the country's population, want to give everything to the Arabs and want to give everything to the Gazans and to the Palestinians, and just want peace. They went into the kibbutzim surrounding Gaza. These are not, by the way, settlements that are so disputed by, when we talk about Israel and Palestine. These are in the sovereign state of Israel. And we're still having reports coming out today of what they did to them, because we have 1,300 and counting dead Israelis, that it is taking a really fucking long time to clean up all of those bodies, and for our kind of volunteers to sort that mess out. And what we're seeing is barbarism of absolute 13th century, medieval barbarism that, that we just haven't seen in the West, other than when you have a rogue, psychopathic serial killer Just to give you some examples, and this might be where you want to pause, this is your trigger warning. Some of the things that they did is they found piles of babies and children and minors with their hands tied that were burnt alive. They didn't have bullet wounds in them, so they weren't shot first and then burnt. They were burnt alive in a big pile. They decapitated babies. They cut off limbs from civilians. We don't know whether that happened before or after their death, if they desecrated the dead bodies or if they cut them off before killing them. And there were pregnant women who were cut open, had their fetuses taken out, and then were killed in front of them. There were women who were raped next to dead bodies, the dead bodies of their husbands, of their children slaughtered in front of their parents. And of course, Hamas took 200 and counting hostages that they've taken back into Israel. We've seen videos of raped and beaten women with their crotches bleeding, being paraded around the streets while everyone cheers and spits on them. This is just absolute. They've taken children and babies and entire families and children without their parents into Gaza as hostages. I am so sick of hearing the catchphrase, Israel has been doing this to Palestinians for 75 years. Israel has not been doing that to Palestinians for the past 75 years. And I've gone over a bit of the history, and I'm not going to go over it again. And there are certainly times when Israel is in the wrong. There are certainly settlements in the West Bank that are highly, highly, highly controversial and that I don't agree with myself as a proud citizen of Israel. And Israelis themselves are massively divided on these topics. But this has never happened and never will happen to Gazans, to Arabs, to Palestinians at the hands of Israelis, because this is psychopathic. This is horrendous. This is beyond anything that the Western world has seen. At the most, we've seen school shootings and we've seen things like 9/11 where people were killed, but the actual act of going through and individually torturing and killing these people in the most brutal ways, we have never seen in the West. We don't have stories and accounts of this really since the Holocaust. And the final myth that I want to attempt to debunk is this idea that this is genocide of Israelis on Palestinians or Arabs. What is genocide is having a goal of killing an entire ethnic group of people. That's another word, ethnic cleansing, which is absolutely not what the Israelis are doing. Hamas, on the other hand, literally have in their charter that their goal is to kill all the Jews, not just kill all the Israelis, but to kill all the Jews. That is ethnic cleansing. That is genocide of proportions that, again, we have not seen since the Holocaust. Israelis do not want to kill innocent Palestinians. Israel says this is this bizarre kind of backwards reality that people live in nowadays, where when somebody literally goes out and says, I want to kill as many Jews as possible, I want to kill all the Jews, that's my life mission, we don't call that genocidal and we don't condemn it as being anti-Semitic. We sort of try to find a way to explain why they feel so strongly, how they've been victimized that would cause them to want to do this. Yet when Israelis target the people who did this to them, we have this bizarre way of calling it genocide. Like if you want to say, like, Israel's goal right now is there are like 20,000 members of Hamas, right? Israel has killed about 2,000 of them so far. So Right now, from where I'm sitting doing this podcast, it looks like we're not even a quarter of a way through this war, right? Israel hasn't even started yet. It has been absolutely unequivocal in its goal of wanting to kill every single member of Hamas. So if you see Hamas as a kind of as an ethnic group, which it is not, it is a terrorist organization, then you could call that genocide because they want to kill every single one of them. But they are not an ethnic group. They are a group of people with absolute genocidal and terrorist ideations who want to wipe all the Jews off the face of the planet. And yet Israelis are the ones that are being called genocidal. Israelis are not doing anything to the Arabs inside Israel, and they're not doing anything to the Arabs in the West Bank. And for a moment here, you have to think, okay, what would Hamas do if they had the military capabilities of killing all the Jews, and destroying Israel? What would they do? And we know what they would do because they've told us that their goal is to wipe all the Jews off the face of the planet. So we have no doubt what their intentions are. Yet you have to ask the same question on the other side. What would Israel do if they had the military capabilities to kill every single Gazan, Palestinian, Arab in the West Bank? What would they do? We know what they would do because they have those capabilities. Israel could destroy and kill every single quote unquote Palestinian in Gaza, Israel, and the West Bank. They could do that over the next week, but they don't. They haven't done that. Israel has the capabilities and has the militaristic capabilities to do that. So we know what their intentions are. People are looking at what's happening in Gaza, and I absolutely feel for them. There is a relentless bombardment of Gaza, and it is all being flattened by the IDF. But again, it keeps getting framed as Israel is just collectively punishing all of Gaza and all Gazans, and this is revenge. They want to kill civilians because this is revenge for what Hamas did. That is a complete distortion of the truth. Israel is trying to kill every single member of Hamas and destroy all of its infrastructure. If it could save every single Gazan life, it would do that. But Hamas has hidden all of its infrastructure in terror tunnels underneath the Gazans, underneath Gaza. 500 kilometers of tunnels run throughout Gaza. 500 kilometers of tunnels. These are extremely well built and engineered to make sure they don't collapse. They have all of their artillery and missile launching pads in very, very densely populated areas like Gaza City. They're using hospitals and schools as launching pads. So you have to ask, when Israel blows up a hospital, do you say, just say what gets reported is Israel just blew up a hospital in Gaza? But when that hospital has tons and tons of artillery, tons of Hamas terrorists in it that are using it as a launching pad and infrastructure to launch missiles into Israel, which is still going on, by the way. Hamas has until now launched over 6,000 rockets into Israel, and it's still happening. Even where I live, in the safest part of Israel, we had 3 alarms and sirens go off just yesterday, where we had to run into a bomb shelter because they are still shooting at us. But they aren't targeting military capabilities. They aren't targeting politicians or leaders of Israel. They are only targeting civilian areas. And they have also sent rockets into Arab areas within Israel because they don't give a fuck. They want to kill all of it. They want to destroy all of it. And this is where we have this absolute obsession in the West of proportionality. Is this a proportionate response? Is this a reasonable response? And if you want to just count civilian lives, which is basically what most of the media are doing, then no, this is not a proportionate response, right? Far more Gazans are being killed than Israelis were. But this is proportionality is not the only lens through which to see this. Intentionality is really, really important here. The goal of, like, the way that it's being framed in the media is that Israel is just indiscriminately firing at Gazans and trying to kill as many Gazans as possible. And this simply isn't true. What Israel are doing is they are targeting key Hamas leaders and members and terrorists, and they are trying to take them out. They are trying to kill them, and they are targeting key military and training facilities that Hamas have. Again, in densely populated areas of Israel, of Gaza, and they are trying to destroy them. They are telling the Gazans to leave these targets because Israel doesn't have a choice but to destroy them. The goal of Israel right now is to destroy every single member of Hamas and every single bit of their infrastructure, right? That's the goal. They don't want to kill. If they could not kill a single Gazan in all of this that is not part of Hamas, that would be what they would do. But this is not possible because Hamas has all their infrastructure embedded in these densely populated areas, hidden underground. They have like an entire city underground. And they are using Gazans as well as, they're using 2 million Gazans as well as the 200 Israeli captives as human shields. And they do not give a fuck about how many Gazans die. In fact, they want Gazans to die because then the Western media says, look how many Gazans Israel has killed. It's collateral damage that works for their propaganda machine. And just to give you an example of how few fucks they give, yesterday, Hamas, or it's been called Islamic Jihad, as I'm not sure if there are separate forces, but Islamic forces in Gaza, they fired a faulty rocket and it hit a hospital. It hit one of their own hospitals and it killed 500 Gazans. And where is the world in condemning this? Where is the world in condemning, if it's just about Palestinian lives, if that's all it is, then surely this is as big an attack. This is twice as big as the attack on the Nova Festival in Israel, where they killed 260 innocent civilians. This is an enormous attack. And yes, the intentionality that I was talking about before isn't there. They didn't intend on killing those people, but the end result is the same. They killed those people. So if we are going to argue that the only thing that matters is the end result of dead Gazans, then you have to condemn that act, even though the intention wasn't there to do it, because that is what is happening on the Israeli side now. They are trying to destroy as much Hamas infrastructure as possible, and Gazans are being used as human shields, and they are dying because they are nearby these military targets. And you have to ask yourself, what was the response after 9/11? After 9/11, the US launched 2 wars, not one, but 2 wars. In the US, there was left and right in the US. You guys don't agree on anything, but this was like a bipartisan consensus that you absolutely have to destroy the threat of Al-Qaeda. And you guys did not hold back at all in trying to eliminate that threat. And the rest of the world supported you in it. And there was no talk. Well, it probably was from some people, but there was almost no talk of proportionality, of holding back, of them not doing it because innocent civilians were going to die and were dying and did die as a result of the US attacks and the wars that the US launched after 9/11. But that is that privilege of peace that I mentioned in the beginning, that it is so easy when you're sitting at home in your lounge in the US and, you haven't experienced actual, your lives actually being at risk. You haven't experienced, the size of 9/11 was much smaller in comparison to population size when you account for population size than this attack was on Israel. Yet the universal outrage across the US, the sense of grief that swept across the US, and the solidarity in removing this threat from the planet was absolutely there. And that's similar to what's happening in Israel now. But when you're sitting in your lounge in the US, in the UK, and you're looking at pictures of and reports of what's happening in Gaza, it's so easy to say, oh God, can't you guys just stop? Can't you guys just, leave them alone? Like, how is this a proportionate response? But when it's happened to you, you've got to put yourself in the shoes of the people who it's happened to. And it has to be said that 9/11, as terrible as it was, it did not pose an existential threat, not even close. Pearl Harbor, it was a terrible, awful attack that is like ingrained in not just the US collective memory, but in the worldwide collective memory as being a horrible, tragic attack. And everyone was united in retaliation of that attack. But neither of those two attacks posed an existential threat, not even close to the US. Whereas this attack, and attacks like it, like the Yom Kippur War, like the 6-Day War, like all of the wars that Israel has fought with its surrounding nations, have posed an existential threat. And I can tell you, as somebody who lives in Israel right now, this for us, we are really acutely aware of the existential threat that is posed to us from Hamas and from this war. Like, a lot of us are thinking about what is going to happen afterwards. Like, are we all going to get murdered? Are we going to go into World War III? Is our country going to be destroyed? Are we going to have a country and a livelihood to get back to after this? Because it really doesn't feel like, and nobody in the US felt that. Nobody felt like, oh, are they going to destroy the US? That was never going to happen. Whereas it feels like a very real possibility right now that that Hamas could destroy Hamas and its sister powers of like the Iran and Lebanon, who, by the way, trust the Lebos to start chucking bombs around when someone else is fighting a war. But Hezbollah on the border, it has been bombing Israel over the past week and a half as well, right? So we have that threat from our northern border too. This is a terrifying, terrifying situation. And when you are sitting in a Western country, safe at home, there is this privilege of peace that's like, some sentiments that I've sort of got across from you guys on Instagram is like, oh, can't everyone just get along, and can't you all just stop killing each other, and like, can't everyone just like, be at peace? Can't you just make peace with the Arabs? But this is such a complex situation, and it's such a privilege of like us in the West. And I know, because I come from that culture where there is no threat, where there isn't that existential threat, where it just feels like, oh, can't we all just stop? Can't we all just get along? And that's really, really nice. And that is one of the lovely things about Western culture, is that we have been working more and more towards that way of doing things, of like peace and collaboration and trying to achieve things together, win-win situations, rather than just indiscriminately bombing and waging war on each other and trying to land grab and trying to kill other tribes. Like, this is not what modern Western democracy is built on. And all of us in the West have been completely involved in these like culture wars of like left and right and whatever else over the past like decades. But in all of that, we lose that sense of like what Western modern values of democracy and peace and cooperation really, really mean, because that is not how the history of most of the world has played out, and it is not the reality of much of the world today. So again, there are these kinds of attitudes around sympathy that are kind of the luxury of a luxury of the secure. When you're in a secure situation, it's very easy to say, oh, can't you just, give Hamas what they want? Can't you just kind of make some concessions? Can't you just, negotiate with them and sort it out? But we in Israel are not in a secure situation, and we don't have the luxury of being timid or being weak, because the people that are trying to kill us and who are on the other side, we don't have the luxury of sort of, showing them mercy and saying, hoping that they're going to show mercy to us, because none of their actions have shown that they're willing to show any mercy towards the state of Israel, towards Israelis, towards Jews. They've refused to return any of the hostages. They refuse any talks, a two-state solution, a possible solution for this. The only thing they want is for all of Israel to be destroyed and all of the Jews killed. So the only thing that they understand is strength. We don't have the privilege of being, of being weak and timid. You have to make them understand that they can't attack you because you're stronger. And what happens if they mess with you is intolerable to them. They aren't listening, and they aren't going to listen to humanitarian appeals like you or like you and I do, because they don't have that. We're talking about a very different kind of way of thinking here, that there is no room for compassion and humanity, especially not towards your enemies. So it's very easy to sit in comfort and security in the West and say, oh, well, can't you just, stop doing this? What is Israel's choice? Like, if we stop the bombardment of Gaza and just say, okay, fine, we'll put our hands up, we'll stop, right? There are still some 18,000 Hamas members, and there is still an enormous amount of Hamas infrastructure and artillery. Like, what do you think is going to happen tomorrow if we call a ceasefire and say, okay, fine, we're getting out, we're going to leave you guys to it, we're going to, we're going to leave you alone, we're going to stop bombing you? What do you think happens to Israel tomorrow? Like, it's not just like, oh, now we can stop and then it's all going to end and everyone's going to, become friends and be happy. Like, it's going to result in another attack and in further attacks and an escalation towards Israel. And this is like a kill or be killed situation, right? Like again, I grew up in modern Britain, in post-World War II Europe. Like, we don't have this concept of like somebody's trying to kill us. Right? If you get attacked in the street by somebody who wants to murder you, you have to fight back, right? You can't just go, oh no, please, I don't want to hurt you. Like, I'm really nice. Like, please don't hurt me. Like, because then you're just a sitting duck. And it's so hard for us when we've come from largely peaceful Western countries to really understand that, to understand what that means when somebody wants you dead, when somebody not just wants you dead, but they want to rape you, they want to cut your head off, they want to torture you. Like again, we're talking about 13th century barbarism here that we haven't seen since like Genghis Khan, and like, this is even like pre-Roman stuff. This is like medieval stuff. And it's also important to understand that this is in a kind of backdrop of kind of a postmodern way of thinking that is seeped with like white guilt. And there are all of these kind of buzzwords of the day, like colonization and victimhood and oppression. And in particular, parts of the progressive left see everything in terms of victim and oppressor, oppressed and oppressor. And they are just grafting that worldview onto this situation because there's no room for nuance. It's black and white. There has to be somebody who's in the right, somebody who's innocent and meek and hasn't done anything wrong, and somebody who is just terrible and awful and just wants to kill everyone. And they can't see any shades of grey or any nuance in between. This is a topic that I want to talk about more, but I can't quite find the right words, this kind of conceptualizing it in terms of like Western ways of thinking. I think Coleman Hughes in his podcast described that really, really, really well. And I'm going to link that podcast in the description below for you to listen to. It's something that I pointed out on my stories and linked in my stories. But for those of you who did miss it, I'm going to put the link to that in the description below, as well as Sam Harris's podcast on moral equivalency here, which I think also really describes those competing worldviews really, really, really well. And I'm also going to link in the description below all of the other podcasts and videos that I have recommended thus far in my stories, so that they're all there for reference, and you can with a brief description of what they touch on, whether it's the history of the area or something else, so that you can use it for reference. So I'm gonna leave it there because I feel like each one of these topics that I've touched on or talked about probably in far too much length in this particular episode, I could make an entire episode on. I've tried to focus on the ideas of proportionality and our kind of black and white way of ascribing victim and perpetrator in these situations rather than seeing shades of grey. But what I want to leave you with is what happens next. Okay, so there are lots and lots of fears of this escalating to a much, much, much wider war. Iran are invested in the destruction of the state of Israel, and they have threatened to get involved. There's a lot of evidence that they've been funding Hamas, and Hamas are ultimately fighting a proxy war for Iran against the state of Israel. There's a lot of fear that Iran is going to get involved. And currently, where I live, there are every few minutes, there's a plane going overhead because we live close to the airport. And there are these enormous carriers going overhead that are from the US Army. The US has sent 3 battleships. Joe Biden is on his way here, and all the generals of the US Army are on their way here, preparing for battle with Iran. Right? This is potentially World War III here, right? Israel has already attacked, I think it's a Syrian airport, because they were getting supplies from Iran. And as I mentioned before, we are being attacked from the north by Hezbollah in Lebanon. This has the potential to blow up into a war of epic proportions. And that is the main fear right now for a lot of us. But what I want to leave you with is what happens next, right? A lot of people are asking Israel this. I'm seeing this in like Channel 4 and BBC reports. They're saying, okay, but let's say you kill all of Hamas. Let's say you get rid of all their infrastructure. They're all dead, right? What happens next? Are you going to reoccupy Gaza? What does that mean for the Gazans who've lost all of their homes? And the response from spokesmen and women from the IDF and from Israel has been, we don't know. We have to deal with this situation in front of us, and we will deal with the aftermath in the aftermath, because we don't have any other option than to destroy the people who are trying to kill us and who have made very clear that their goal and intentions are to kill us. But I want to put that question back to Hamas and because I haven't seen them do that in these like Channel 4 reports and stuff like that. They haven't been putting that back to the Palestinians, to the Arabs, and say, okay, but like Hamas are refusing to return the 200 Israelis that were kidnapped into Gaza. They've refused to talk about peace agreements. They are continuing to send rockets into civilian areas. Nobody is asking them, okay, sorry about that, okay, but what happens next? What, like, you keep fighting Israel, you keep trying to kill its civilians, like, what happens after this? What happens? How are you going to, when this war ends, how are you going to rebuild Gaza? How are you going to build a Palestinian state? How is this helping you advance towards those goals? Because Israel is getting asked that over and over and over again, but Hamas and Gaza is not. And I do want to leave you with that question of like, what are they going to get out of it if they just keep going full steam ahead? The goal is to kill Jews. What is next? What happens next? What do they rebuild from the rubble? How does this advance their goals? So that's it. That's my first, I don't know if it will be my last podcast episode on what's going on at the moment. I know I'm emotional. I know that was not very polished. I know that, I don't know. I don't even know if I have made any good points or if I've just rambled. I would obviously love to hear from you. My main goal in all of this is conversation and opening up conversations. Let me know what you thought of this. Let me know if you found it useful. Let me know if you found it boring or overwhelming. Let me know if it cleared anything up, if it made you think differently, or if it just further entrenched your beliefs. Let me know if you have more questions. Really, just anything that criticism or everything from like praise to criticism and everything in between. I want to hear it. And I appreciate you listening and I appreciate your input.